Most people have no idea how much energy they spend just trying to explain themselves. You don't speak to share. You speak to be accepted. You don't try to understand others. You're trying to make them understand you, to make sure you're not misunderstood, not hated, not seen as the wrong one. But in that moment, you've already stepped away from your center, because the moment you need someone to believe you, you've unconsciously handed them the power to decide your worth. Psychology calls this the compulsion to explain, an unconscious reflex that appears when a person feels threatened in a relationship. As a child, you learned that love doesn't come for free. It depended on how easy you were to please, how understandable, how forgiving. You learned to explain yourself to avoid conflict, to keep peace, and not to lose connection. And when you grew up, that pattern never left. You can't stop defending yourself because deep down, you're still afraid of being abandoned. Carl Jung once said, "A person cut off from their true self will always seek external validation to fill the inner void." When you live to be understood, you stop being real. You start reacting to the world instead of living from within. Every time you try to prove your good intentions, you reinforce the belief that you are not pure enough to be trusted. And just like that, you become a prisoner of approval. No one forces you to explain, yet you still do, as if hypnotized by your own need to be seen as good. This video will help you see what Jung saw long ago. That freedom doesn't come when others finally understand you, but when you no longer need to prove anything at all. There is a kind of exhaustion only people who constantly feel they have to explain can understand. You leave a meeting and immediately rewrite every sentence in your head to be sure. You send a short text, but then add 3 more messages so you won't be misunderstood. You speak about your boundaries and then send a long follow-up to prove you're not selfish. None of this happens because you're unclear. It happens because your body is activating a survival reflex. Psychology calls it fawning. Instead of fight, flight, or freeze, you soothe to reduce the risk of rejection. As a child, you learned, "If I make the adults comfortable, I will be loved." That belief became an introjected voice that rises every time you're about to express something true. Don't upset them. Say it softer. Explain more. And so you walk into an inner courtroom where you play both the defendant and the attorney, trying to prove your innocence. The problem is that the more you explain, the weaker your position becomes. You hand over judgment to the outside and admit that your inner truth can't stand unless it's certified by someone else. This is the core of what Jung described as the split of the self. One half wants honesty, the other only wants safety. You say, "I'm fine," and rush to add, "because," as if silence were evidence against you. You place, "I didn't mean that," before anyone has a chance to doubt you. You work as a full-time translator for your own emotions. The result is loss of inner sovereignty. Your real feelings blur. Your boundaries blur. Your nervous system lives in a low-level alert that never switches off. Easy to exhaust, easy to self-blame, easy to say goodbye to yourself, just to keep others calm. The deeper fear isn't fear of being misunderstood. It's the fear of being abandoned once you're no longer pleasant. That's why you confuse connection with submission, politeness with self-erasure. In everyday life, this looks subtle. You laugh when nothing is funny. You compliment to avoid silence. You take the blame to shorten a conflict. You add a clarifying paragraph, even when your heart is tired. All for one goal: reduce the risk of rejection. But the price you pay is leaving your own center each time. The truth is that the people who most demand your explanations are rarely the ones who truly want to understand you. They want you to stay predictable. The ones who really see you can feel the weight of your presence without needing a footnote attached. If you recognize yourself somewhere in this journey, click subscribe to keep going deeper with Jung. Thank you for being here. Your very presence is what makes inner journeys like this real. Carl Jung once said, "We are not hurt by what happens, but by how we interpret it." When you live in a state of always having to prove yourself, what you are really trying to do is not change others, but soothe the fear of being rejected. Behind every explanation hides a silent insecurity. If they misunderstand, I will lose my place. That feeling makes your mind run endlessly, scanning every small detail like a guard stationed at a fragile bridge between being accepted and being left behind. Jung referred to this as the reaction of a split soul. Half of you want to live honestly, the other only wants to be safe. You want to speak the truth, but fear that truth will make people walk away. So you choose softer words. You choose silence when you should talk. You choose a smile instead of showing your fatigue. Each time you do, you lose another small piece of yourself, not because someone took it, but because you handed it over in exchange for a sense of safety. This mechanism creates an unconscious chain of reflexes. A shift in someone's tone or a flicker in their eye, and your body already reacts. Your heart races, your stomach tightens, your throat closes. You know you're about to say something to smooth things over. But that very moment is when you are pulled out of your internal authority, the right to own your feelings and your boundaries. Jung called this the most subtle slip of the soul. When you let others define your value, you stop living in the real world and start living in the world they project. The most frightening part is that the more you explain, the more you reinforce the belief that you must explain. You become the builder of endless bridges no one crosses. And one day you realize you've spoken so much but been heard so little. If you feel yourself entering this stage, don't panic. Because in the next part, we will go deeper into why Jung called this the pain of consciousness, and how awakening can make you see what others always try to avoid. Stay with me, because there you will discover you're not alone on this path. At the deepest layer of your psyche, the way you keep explaining yourself is not a habit. It's an inheritance, an unconscious mechanism passed down from the past, from the place where the child in you once learned that to be loved, you had to be easy to understand. Jung called this the split of the self, the separation between the true self and the accepted self. As a child, you could not resist the power of the adults, so you learned to adjust your emotions to stay safe. As you grew, the reflex didn't disappear. It only disguised itself under reasons like, "I just want people to understand me." But you're not communicating. You're negotiating. Every explanation is a request for permission to exist. Psychology calls this introjection, swallowing the commands, judgments, and voices of others until they become the voices inside your head. Every time you're about to speak something true, that voice rises. "Don't say that, they'll get angry." Or, "Make it softer." You obey, believing silence will preserve peace. But in truth, you're preserving the prison. Carl Jung wrote, "We do not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." The shadow inside you is the part that was forced into silence. It's still alive, still watching, still waiting to be acknowledged. Every time you over-explain, that shadow is reminding you that you were once made to doubt yourself. And only when you recognize this does the reassembly begin. In your mind, there's always a place like a courtroom where old voices sit in the judge's seat. They're no longer real, but you still hear them. Every time you speak, they raise their hands to object. And you, by reflex, defend yourself again. But what you don't see is this. None of them are there anymore. They're only echoes of memory. You're fighting people who left long ago. When you realize this, you no longer want to win conversations. You just want silence. Not to endure, but to stop betraying yourself. That silence at first can feel terrifying, as if you're losing your voice. But in reality, it's the first time you're hearing your true voice, without filters, without fear. And then, one day, you will no longer want to explain, not because you're arrogant, but because you no longer need to be forgiven. You will see that every courtroom was only an illusion of the mind, and when you step out of it, silence will become the only proof you need. In that moment, you are no longer on trial. Imagine that somewhere in your mind, there exists a strange room with no doors and no light. In the center stands a long table covered with papers. Every word you've ever said, every act you've tried to justify, every proof you've ever offered. Around the table are empty chairs, yet you know exactly who once sat there. The strict father, the demanding teacher, the partner who never believed you were enough. Each with a different voice, but all with the same gaze, the gaze of doubt. And you, like an invisible defendant, sit among them holding a trembling page of self-defense. This is the inner courtroom, the trial within. Every time you feel misunderstood, the room opens again. Every time you want to be believed, you step back inside, preparing arguments, evidence, and explanations. But here's the strange thing. No one is actually there. The voices are only echoes, memories engraved in your unconscious, remnants of authority you've kept to remind yourself to be careful. You are no longer speaking to the person in front of you. You are speaking to the past. In analytical psychology, Jung called this complex reenactment, when the psyche recreates an old situation, hoping to repair it in the present. You're not living with the person before you. You're still facing the one who once made you feel small. Every time you explain, you're trying to win the old trial, the one where you lost, where you were silenced. But here's the truth you've missed. You've grown, and they are no longer there. You've been sentencing yourself for a crime that no longer exists. If you sit quietly enough, you'll notice something strange. The voices of the judge, the witnesses, even your own voice begin to fade. Silence settles over everything like dust in time. And in that silence, you realize something. No one needs to declare you innocent, because you were never guilty. That guilt is only the residue of someone who once convinced you that you had to be gentle to be loved. Jung once said, "The darkness disappears only when we bring the light of consciousness to it." When you finally see that the courtroom exists only in your mind, it dissolves. You don't need to win, you just need to leave. And as you stand up, silence follows you like an old friend. For the first time, you don't feel lonely in that quiet. You feel free, because true freedom never begins when others believe you. It begins when you no longer have to prove a thing. If you look closely, every time someone misunderstands you, your first feeling isn't anger, it's panic. A part of you jumps up, ready to defend. Your heart beats faster, your breath shortens, and you can barely stay still. This isn't a rational response, it's survival. In the moment you're misunderstood, your mind believes you're losing safety, as if something bad will happen if you don't quickly fix the story. You can see this in the smallest situations. When someone seems cold, you immediately ask yourself what you did wrong. When a close friend doesn't reply to your message, you feel the need to send another explanation to show you're not upset. When someone disagrees with you, you start speaking more, softer, more carefully. Not because they need clarity, but because you're afraid of losing your place in their eyes. All these reactions come from the same wound, the wound of being rejected. Psychology calls it internalized rejection sensitivity, a heightened sensitivity to the possibility of being turned away. It makes you read every silence as danger, and so you become the one who always tries to clarify, even when no one has asked. You say, "I just want things to be clear," but in truth, you're trying to prove you're still worthy of love. Your body knows this before your mind does. Shoulders tense, throat tight, hands unconsciously clenched as if gripping the last thread of connection. Jung wrote, "A person's shadow is not evil, but the part that has never been acknowledged." When you stop explaining, that shadow rises. Fear, anger, the feeling of injustice. And you think you're becoming selfish. But in reality, it's the part of you reclaiming space that's been taken too long. Each time you choose silence instead of self-defense, you're training your nervous system in a new reflex, the reflex of calm. And something interesting happens. When you stop trying to prove you're right, people begin to experience you differently. Your voice carries more weight. Your eyes become steadier. Not because you win, but because you're no longer in defense. Your presence becomes quiet, clear, and enough. The moment you pause before explaining, just to take a deep breath, is the moment you're stepping out of the old courtroom. No defendant, no judge, just you, and the silent truth that has always been yours. Carl Jung once said, "A man will never be free as long as he still feels the need to justify himself." When you stop explaining, you are not simply becoming quiet to the world. You are breaking an invisible contract your mind once signed with fear. That contract says, "If I keep everyone pleased, I will be safe." But real safety doesn't come from agreement. It comes from the ability to remain still while being misunderstood. And that is the hardest lesson of all. You cannot heal while you're still trying to be seen. Because every time you explain yourself, you are reviving the very structure that once took your freedom. You hand back the authority to define you, letting others decide if you're right or wrong, good or bad. Jung called this shadow dependency, the unconscious need for others to illuminate your darkness. As long as you need them to understand, you haven't truly seen yourself. There's a kind of deep exhaustion that only those who live to be understood will know. It's when you realize you've spent your life choosing words, tones, and timing, just to make sure no one misreads you. Yet no matter how careful you are, someone always will. And what truly hurts isn't the misunderstanding. It's the constant feeling that you must keep proving you're trustworthy. But you owe the world no explanation. Truth needs no defense. It only needs to be lived. If your silence is rooted in integrity, it will speak louder than any words. The world may call that arrogance, coldness, or mystery. But to Jung, it's a sign of an awakening soul, one no longer controlled by reaction. And you'll notice something. When you stop explaining, people will leave. Some will say you've changed. Some will feel threatened. Others will try to pull you back into the familiar courtroom where they once watched you defend yourself. But this time, you don't need to sit down because you've realized something profound. You were never the defendant. You were the witness all along. The first stillness might feel frightening, as if the world is withdrawing from you. But the truth is, you are the one withdrawing from the noisy world of justification. When that silence arrives, don't run. Don't fill it with compromise, soft words, or the reflex of, "I didn't mean it like that." Stay. Stay long enough to hear what exists beneath it. Because inside that silence is your return to wholeness, the moment the trial finally ends. And if you are standing inside that quiet right now, don't leave. Stay with me until the end of this video, because what comes next is what most people never realize. That real power doesn't live in being understood, but in your capacity to endure not being understood. Because sometimes your silence is the answer the world is not yet ready to hear. Learning to stop explaining yourself is not a slogan. It's psychological training. You are not trying to silence your voice, but to reclaim it from the old courtroom inside your mind. The goal is not perfection, but awareness. Begin simply by noticing when the trial begins. Every time you feel the impulse to justify, pause half a breath. Inhale slowly and ask yourself, do I want to be understood, or am I afraid of being misunderstood? This single question breaks the reflex. In that moment, you step out of the defendant's chair and take your place as the observer. Next, practice sitting with misunderstanding. When someone misinterprets you, try staying silent for a few seconds. The discomfort that rises is not danger. It is your nervous system learning that silence is safe. The more you stay with it, the more your body learns that peace is not dependent on approval. Then, make one small daily vow. Choose something you will not explain. Decline an invitation without reasons. Keep quiet after expressing a boundary. End a message without softening your truth. Each time you do, you reclaim a piece of inner sovereignty, what Jung called the return of inner authority. And as this authority grows, your relationships begin to change. People who value control will pull away. People who value truth will come closer. Do not chase either. Just remain centered. Freedom will not come from winning every conversation, but from realizing you no longer need to defend your existence to be real. Because peace begins in the same place where the courtroom ends. The moment you finally stop pleading your own innocence. When you stop explaining yourself, the first thing you meet isn't freedom, it's emptiness. A strange silence that makes you feel bare, as if something precious has been lost. There are no long conversations to defend your meaning, no more justifications to hold the connection. You'll feel as though you've lost the world. But the truth is, you've only stepped out of the old courtroom, the one where you were once forced to prove your innocence. Jung once said, "Wholeness is not achieved by cutting off the light from the darkness, but by integrating both." When you stop explaining, you begin to reclaim both. The light, your honest voice, and the dark, your fear of rejection. There is no one left to blame, no one left to convince. Only you standing before yourself. No roles, no judges, no witnesses. Just presence. And then, something remarkable happens. When you no longer need to be understood, people start to hear you differently. They sense something they couldn't before. A stillness with weight. It isn't the silence of repression, but the silence of someone who has finally seen themselves. Every word you speak, every gesture, every glance, carries the gravity of integration. This silence doesn't need to persuade. It simply is. And that existence alone becomes proof enough. Because in the end, you don't need anyone to believe you. You only need to believe in yourself. The truth within you doesn't need defense. It needs embodiment. Jung called this process integration, the union of the self. It is the moment you stop waiting for permission to be yourself and begin to live as someone who has been allowed all along. You no longer need to win in any courtroom because no one is judging anymore. The trial has dissolved. And what remains is not a voice, but a profound stillness that makes everything else transparent. A stillness that no longer requires explanation. A truth that no longer needs protection. A human being who no longer needs to be understood to finally be whole. Imagine standing in that room once more. The inner courtroom, But this time, no one sits in the judge's chair. The old papers have scattered, the familiar voices have gone quiet. Only you remain, sitting in the stillness, hearing the sound of your own breath echo in a way it never has before. You realize you no longer need to speak to prove anything, nor stay silent to be accepted. Everything that's left is simply presence. You rise and open the door that you once thought was locked forever. The light doesn't rush in. It gently spills across the floor, as if it had always been there, waiting for you to lift your head. And as you step out, the world remains unchanged. People still judge, still misunderstand, still react the way they always have. But this time, you no longer belong in that courtroom. Peace no longer comes from being believed. It comes from no longer needing belief. Silence is no longer a defense. It has become your boundary. And in that quiet, you begin to hear something that was once drowned out. Your true voice. It isn't loud or grand, but deep and steady. Each word, each breath carries the weight of someone who no longer lives to be accepted. When the door closes softly behind you, you'll feel another journey begin, not to prove your truth, but to learn the art of speaking less and listening more. Because in the next video, perhaps that voice you've just begun to hear will lead you somewhere new, a place where silence no longer hides your power, but becomes it.